Everything in life moves in a circle. We get up every morning, do the same things, repeat the same words. For 25 years of marriage, I got used to this routine, and it seemed to me that it was an indicator of stability, of the strength of our union. After all, if every day is similar to the previous one, doesn't that mean we're doing well? I met Crystal when I was 22. She was 2 years younger, with bright green eyes, and a smile that literally lit up everything around her. I fell in love instantly. We met at a party at a mutual friend's house, and I remember not being able to take my eyes off her. She was laughing, and in that moment I decided that I would do anything to make sure she was always happy. That became my top priority for years to come. Our relationship grew rapidly, and 2 years later we were married. The wedding was simple but warm. I remember looking at Crystal in her white dress standing next to her and thinking, this is for life. I was more sure of it then than anything else. We were building a life together, a house, a job, children. Everything seemed perfect, although, as I realize now, I believed too soon that it would last forever. The first few years were eventful. The birth of our children, our careers, new purchases. We laughed, we fought, we made up, but we were always each other's mainstay in this world. I got used to seeing Crystal around me every day, used to the way she spoke, to her smell, to her touch. It became something as familiar as breathing. I'd been working the same job for the past 15 years, and our life flowed in a measured fashion. The kids were grown, the house was stable, and our marriage seemed to have survived every possible hardship. Around us, many couples were getting divorced, some for money, some for infidelity, some for constant scandals. I was sure it wasn't about us. We were a team. But in the last few years, something started to change. Although I didn't notice the change for a long time, Crystal was becoming more and more aloof. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. It wasn't much. Maybe she was just stressed out at work or tired. We both worked a lot, and the time we spent together was getting shorter and shorter. Sometimes I'd catch her, deep in her phone, with some unfamiliar expression on her face. She would wave it off, saying it was nothing. But there was something new in her voice, some coldness or something. I tried to talk to her about it, but the conversations boiled down to the standard answers. It's okay. I'm just tired. Don't worry, it's only temporary. But truth be told, I was starting to feel like something important was slipping through our fingers. At night, lying in bed next to her, I felt the distance between us become greater than ever before. Her presence was physical, but emotionally it was like she was somewhere else. I couldn't find an explanation for it, but I knew our relationship had changed. We used to be able to talk about everything, discuss plans for the future, talk about what we cared about. Now our conversations were dry, superficial. It seemed that every word was carefully calibrated and devoid of meaning. We exchanged only the most necessary phrases, as if we were negotiating rather than having a conversation between spouses. It disturbed me. I couldn't figure out what was wrong, but the feeling grew like a thorn in my side. And the more time passed, the harder it became to ignore the warning signs. But even when everything inside me was screaming that something was wrong, I convinced myself that it was just a crisis, a normal part of any marriage. I believed it could be fixed. We'd been together for 25 years. Too long for anything to ruin our union. Or was it just that I didn't want to believe it? One night, I decided to take her out to dinner. I thought it would help bring back at least some of the warmth that had been between us before. We chose a cozy downtown restaurant we'd gone to years ago. It seemed like it would bring us closer together. But she sat there all evening, staring at her phone, barely looking at me. "You're here with me, aren't you?" I asked at one point. She looked up, pretended to be surprised by my question, but quickly returned to the screen again. It was then that I felt for the first time that I was really losing her, but something inside me kept saying, "It's just a phase. Things will get better." We continue the story, delving deeper into the unfolding of events and immersing Chuck in the realization of his growing anxiety. In part 2, we don't bring things to a breaking point yet, but we create more tension and point out signs of impending disaster. After that night at the restaurant, things became even more obvious. Whereas before I had just suspected something was wrong, now every conversation we had, every day we spent together, was filled with a sense of impending disaster. I tried not to panic, tried to talk to Crystal, to find an explanation for her detachment, but each time she drifted farther away, as if there was an invisible wall growing between us that I couldn't overcome. One night, after dinner, I decided to broach the subject of our relationship directly. "Crystal, I want to talk to you," I began cautiously. She was sitting on the couch, once again staring at her phone. The device seemed to have become her constant companion, pulling her attention away from anything that concerned our family. She cast a quick glance at me, but didn't take her eyes off the screen. "About what?" she answered indifferently. "About us," I said, trying to remain calm, though inside everything was clenching with worry. Crystal put the phone aside, but with a look like it was burdensome to her. She looked at me, waiting for me to continue. "I feel like we've drifted apart," I began, not knowing how to phrase my feelings more accurately. "You've become some sort of stranger. We hardly talk anymore, we don't spend time together. Has something changed?" For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something resembling sympathy in her eyes, but it disappeared immediately, giving way to the cold expression I was used to encountering. She sighed, as if this conversation was a waste of time for her. "Chuck, it's okay," she replied. "You're just thinking about it too much. We're doing fine. We're just growing up. It's natural for relationships to change." Her words should have reassured me, but instead I felt even more anxious. The way she said, "we're growing up," sounded like it was an excuse for her indifference, as if our marriage was something past for her, something that no longer mattered to her. "But it's not just growing up," I insisted. "You hardly ever talk to me. You're on your phone all the time. When I try to get close to you, you just pull away." "I don't pull away," she countered, though her tone wasn't convinced. "You're just being overly sensitive, Chuck. It's okay." Those words hit me. Sensitive? Maybe I was. But isn't it wrong to feel like there's something wrong with your marriage? Isn't it normal to worry that the person you've lived half your life with is moving away from you for no apparent reason? A few minutes passed before she picked up her phone again and continued scrolling through her social media feed like nothing had happened. I sat across from her, feeling completely invisible. It was as if my whole world was now reduced to watching Crystal sink into virtual reality, leaving me alone with my own thoughts. After this conversation, I began to notice even more little things that had previously escaped my attention. Crystal started coming home late from work, citing extra projects or delays. When I asked her for details, she answered evasively, as if these questions annoyed her. New things appeared in her closet that I didn't know about. She began to spend more time with her friends, going out in the evenings to meetings she told me little about. One night, when I was about to fall asleep, I heard her phone ring. She quickly grabbed it from the nightstand and headed into the bathroom, closing the door behind her. It was weird. She used to always leave her phone next to the bed at night, and no calls would interrupt our sleep. When she came back, I asked her who it was. "No one important." She cut me off and immediately turned away as if this conversation was over. I couldn't get enough of the way she answered. No one important. We used to share everything. Who called, why, when, what was on the agenda. Now her answers were short and curt, like she was hiding something. I began to suspect it wasn't just work or fatigue. But I was afraid to admit it to myself. With each passing day, I could feel the tension building up inside me. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that Crystal was just going through some phase and everything would go back to normal. But one morning, when she left for work earlier than usual again, I decided to check her phone. She'd left it on the kitchen table, forgetting to turn it off. My heart beat faster as I approached the device. I'd never done anything like this before, and I was disgusted at the very thought that I was going to rummage through her private messages. But I couldn't stop myself. I opened her messengers and started flipping through. At first, there was nothing suspicious. Correspondence with coworkers, with friends. But then I came across a message from an unfamiliar number. It had just one smiley face, a heart, and Crystal's reply. "See you tonight." A chill swept over me. Who is this person? Why is she sending him such messages? Why didn't I know about the meeting? I spent a few minutes going through the correspondence history. It was everything. Short but intimate messages, uncluttered but with a clear subtext. It was as if something existed between them that required no explanation. My heart beat in my throat as I realized this wasn't just a friend. It was something more. I didn't know what to do. Putting my phone back where it belonged, I walked out of the house to gather my thoughts. But how can you gather your thoughts when your world starts to fall apart? I wandered through the streets, feeling the ground go from under my feet. What I saw was proof that my worst fears were beginning to come true. Back home, I tried to act normal. Crystal returned in the evening, just like she said she would in the message, but there wasn't the slightest sign of guilt on her face. She looked as calm as ever, and that only added to my pain. How much longer was she going to keep pretending we were okay? Got it. We'll move the plot slowly and gradually, emphasizing how Crystal carefully covered her tracks and how it affected Chuck. We'll start with how he increasingly loses his peace before he decides to take the step of hiring a detective. After our conversation with Crystal, the uneasiness that had settled in my soul only grew stronger. She continued to act as if nothing had happened. We were living under the same roof, doing the usual chores, but something was bothering me. Every day, her behavior became more and more suspicious to me, although at first glance everything seemed fine. She hadn't changed in her interactions with me or in her daily routine, and that was what was strange. She still came home on time, cooked dinner, watched soap operas in the evenings. Everything seemed the same as it had been for the past few years. But now every step she took seemed devoid of real meaning. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was just a facade, carefully constructed to hide the truth from me. One evening, when she came home later than usual, I noticed again the restrained attachment that seemed to have settled between us. A familiar feeling flared up inside me, but I didn't question it. At times like this, I realized that any talk would only push her further away, leaving me alone with my suspicions. But the silence was unbearable. Every time she picked up her phone, I caught myself unable to take my eyes away. Crystal was always careful, never leaving her phone in plain sight, always turning off the sound and screen as soon as I got close. And every time, it was like a stabbing reminding me that something was wrong. But despite everything I noticed, I had no real proof. Everything seemed like random coincidences. One night, I couldn't stand it and decided to broach the subject again, trying to find an explanation for her behavior. I sat down next to her on the couch as she was browsing through something on her phone as usual. "Crystal," I began cautiously, "you've been spending a lot of time on your phone lately. Is everything okay?" She looked at me with slight bewilderment, as if she didn't know what I meant. "Yes, Chuck, everything's fine," she replied calmly. "I'm just checking messages. It's just normal work stuff." Her answer sounded so casual, so confident, I almost believed it. Almost. But something inside me told me it wasn't the whole truth. "You know I'm worried," I continued. "We've barely spoken lately, and I feel like you're distancing yourself." Her face changed a little. She sighed heavily, like she was tired of discussing the topic. "Chuck, you're overthinking this. We're doing fine. You're just being too wishy-washy." She went back to her phone as if this conversation was over, leaving me with the same emptiness inside. Her confident answers and calmness put me on edge again. Maybe she was right? Maybe I really am winding myself up and imagining problems that aren't there. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the feeling of unease never left me. Every move she made, every phone call or text she made, seemed to me like hidden signs of something bigger. As time went on, I began to notice that Crystal was leaving more and more often in the evenings under the pretense of going out to meet her friends or work. She still seemed calm, and there was nothing suspicious about her behavior at first glance. But I couldn't shake the thought that it was all a disguise. It was several weeks before I realized that I could no longer bear the strain myself. My days were filled with doubt and anxiety, and I didn't know what to do next. Discussing it with Crystal was pointless. Every time she assured me that I was just worrying for nothing. But I couldn't take her word for it anymore. I needed proof. I needed the truth to put these suspicions to rest once and for all. And then I decided to take a step that I had never even considered seriously before. I decided to hire a private detective. Deep down, I was ashamed of this decision, as if I was betraying my own trust in the man I'd lived with for 25 years. But the fear that I might be right was stronger. I contacted the detective on the recommendation of an acquaintance who had already used his services. We met at a small cafe to discuss the details. The detective looked typical of his craft. A middle-aged man with a tired face and shrewd eyes that read the experience of years of experience. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked me when I explained my situation. "Yes," I replied, no longer doubting. "I need to know the truth." He nodded and asked a few more questions about Crystal, her schedule, her habits, the names of her girlfriends. I answered as accurately as I could, even though I felt like every answer I gave was distancing me from her even more. It was a strange feeling, like I was ruining the very thing I was trying to save. "Don't expect quick results," he warned me at the end. "Cases like this usually take time. If she's really hiding something, it may not be immediately obvious." I nodded. Time was the last thing I had left. I was willing to wait, just to find out the truth. For the first few weeks after the detective started his work, nothing happened. Every day I checked my phone, waiting for news, but there was none. Crystal still acted like everything was fine. Sometimes I even began to doubt that my suspicions were well-founded. Maybe I was really wrong and the detective wouldn't find anything. Maybe I was just imagining the problem. But every time I saw her with the phone or when she left in the evening, those thoughts returned. My doubts slowly turned into despair, and each day I found it harder and harder to hide my condition. Weeks continued to drag on waiting until one day, after almost a month, the detective finally called me. "Chuck, I need to see you," he said without further ado. His voice sounded serious, and I knew right away that this was not a case where he would call for nothing. We agreed to meet later that day, and I felt everything inside of me turn upside down. My heart was beating so hard that I could barely focus on my thoughts. This was the moment I had to know the truth. The truth that I had been running from for the past few months. When I arrived for the meeting, the detective was already waiting for me around the corner of the cafe where we first met. He looked as calm as ever, but in his eyes I saw something he usually hid from his clients: sympathy. "What did you find out?" I asked, barely containing my excitement. He opened a folder of photos and laid them out in front of me on the table. My heart sank when I saw them. It was undeniable. Crystal with another man. First they sat in the restaurant, then they walked down the street holding hands, and finally they disappeared into his car. I couldn't take my eyes off those images, as if they were some kind of terrifying nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. "These are all from the last few days," the detective explained. "They occur regularly." I felt the ground go from under my feet. As the detective laid out the photos in front of me, the world around me froze. It felt like time had stopped, and I was alone with this undeniable evidence of Crystal's infidelity. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the first picture. It showed her sitting at a table in a restaurant, across from a man I had never seen before. They were looking at each other with an expression I didn't think I'd seen in our relationship in a long time. Something warm, intimate, hidden from me for years. With each new photo, reality shattered more and more of what I had tried hard to keep. She was holding his hand, laughing, looking at him with tenderness. I saw her as happy and carefree as she hadn't been with me in probably 10 years. But instead of joy for her, I felt unbearable pain. The detective kept talking, explaining the details of his observations, where they had met, how many times it had happened, how long they had been hiding from each other. But I could barely hear him. Every word he said seemed distant, as if I were underwater, surrounded by the hum of other people's voices. All I could see in front of me were pictures. Those damn pictures that were now proof that my life, my family, everything I'd believed in for the past 25 years had crumbled. "Chuck," the detective's voice interrupted my thoughts. "I realize this isn't easy, but you should know that this isn't an isolated incident. They occur quite often." I nodded silently, as if my thoughts were paralyzed. I couldn't say anything in response. Inside me, everything was screaming, but on the outside, I was completely calm. It was silly to expect anything different. I hired a detective to find the truth, and there it was, in front of me, in those pictures. When the detective put the photos away in a folder and said he'd send me a full report later, I automatically thanked him. My words felt foreign, empty. It was a mechanical act, as if I was just an observer of my own life. We said goodbye, and I walked slowly to my car, feeling a lingering wave of pain begin to rise in my chest. I got behind the wheel, but I couldn't start the car. My hands rested on the steering wheel, but my fingers seemed lifeless. I just sat there staring in front of me, trying to realize what was going to happen now. I probably should have felt rage, resentment, anger, but instead, all I felt was emptiness. It felt like everything inside of me had burned out. Over the past weeks, I'd been pushing myself toward this truth, preparing myself for it. But the collision with reality was far more powerful than I could have imagined. How long it was before I started the car and drove home, I don't remember. All I remember was how slowly the road stretched under my wheels, and how I didn't want to go back to where Crystal was waiting for me. But I had to go back. I couldn't hide from it any longer. When I entered the house, it was late. Crystal was already home, and when I saw her sitting quietly on the couch reading a book, something inside me exploded. How could she? How could she act so calmly as if nothing had happened? I silently walked past her into the kitchen, feeling an icy chill spread through my body. I put the kettle on the stove, but I couldn't remember why. Every action was pointless. She came up to me a few minutes later, apparently sensing my tension. Her voice was still as calm, serene. "Chuck, are you okay?" she asked, as if nothing had happened. Her serenity only added fuel to the fire. I turned to her, trying to hold back my emotions. "Are you okay?" I repeated, feeling the anger boiling up inside me. "How can you ask me that?" She looked at me surprised, but with no fear, no excitement. Just with slight bewilderment, as if I'd said something she hadn't expected. "What do you mean?" she asked calmly. That calm tone of hers was the last straw. I couldn't hold back any longer. I wasn't going to start this conversation like this, but the words just came out. "You think I don't know anything?" I said, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. "You think your little secrets will go unsolved?" Her face remained as nonchalant as ever, which only made me angrier. "I hired a detective, Crystal," I blurted out. "He's been following you, and I have proof. I know everything." Silence. No reaction. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look stunned or scared. She just looked at me and, to my surprise, shrugged. "So what?" she said calmly, as if it was some minor incident. I was stunned. That reaction of hers was the last thing I expected. No apology, no excuses, not even a hint of regret. She just stood in front of me as if nothing important had happened. "So what?" I couldn't believe my ears. "Are you serious? You're not even trying to justify yourself? You won't say anything about what you did?" She looked at me calmly, and I realized there wasn't an ounce of remorse in her eyes. "I'm tired, Chuck," she said finally. "Tired of us. Tired of this endless talk, tired of our problems. Do you want to know the truth? Yes, I cheated on you. But I stopped feeling anything for you a long time ago. And to be honest, I don't think it matters that much." Those words hit me harder than anything I'd heard before. Her indifference was almost physically tangible. She stood in front of me like she was just discussing the weather or weekend plans. No drama, no emotion. Just a cold admission that 25 years of marriage meant nothing to her. "You didn't even try to save our marriage?" My voice shook, and I could no longer hide my emotions. "You just let everything fall apart?" Crystal sighed and turned away, looking out the window. "Chuck, we haven't been together for a long time," she said quietly but firmly. "You just didn't want to admit it." I didn't know what to say. I stared at her and tried to realize that our marriage had been dead for a long time, long before I knew about the affair. Her indifference to our past was just killing me. I thought it couldn't get any worse, but it turns out you can be betrayed not only by actions, but also by words, and even by silence. I left that night. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I left the house and drove wherever I wanted to go. My mind was in chaos. What Crystal had said was still echoing in my head, like the echoes of a blow I couldn't recover from. How could it be? 25 years of marriage, more than 2 decades of life together, And it all meant nothing to her. She didn't even try to fight, made no attempt to explain, justify, or apologize. She'd said outright that she'd stopped feeling anything for me, as if it were just an ordinary, mundane statement. Inside, everything was boiling with anger and hurt. I thought about Crystal dating that man, laughing with him, spending evenings with him that she should have been spending with me. But her indifference was even worse than the infidelity itself. She'd been gone from me emotionally for a long time, and I hadn't even noticed it. I was blind, clinging to the illusion that things could still be fixed. I stopped the car at some roadside diner and stared out the windshield at the dark night sky without getting out. All my attempts to figure out how this happened led to a dead end. Is it possible to give up so easily what we had built together for so many years? Can one be so indifferent to the idea that marriage is just fatigue that can be thrown off like tired clothes? I loved her. I still do, despite everything. Why didn't she try? Why did it end so easily? My thoughts were shifting, coming in waves, and I hadn't even noticed the hours that had passed during these ruminations. It was as if time had lost all meaning, and I remained in the same state, broken, powerless, and not knowing what to do next. After a while, I decided to call Jim, my friend. He was the first person I decided to confide in. Jim had been my best friend since college, and if anyone could listen to me and help me, it was him. The phone rang a few times before Jim answered. I heard his sleepy voice. It was past midnight, and of course he was asleep. Chuck? His voice sounded a note of alarm. What's wrong? Is everything okay? I'm sorry to call so late, Jim. I need to talk. My words were shaky, and I heard him start to gather his thoughts as he woke up. Chuck, is it something serious? His voice became softer and more attentive. He knew that if I was calling at a time like this, it meant something important had happened. I took a deep breath and began to tell him. I told him everything. How I'd suspected Crystal over the past months, how I'd hired a detective, and finally how I'd found evidence of her cheating. I told him about her indifference, about that cold confession, and how she had long ago stopped feeling anything for me. It was hard, but the relief of being able to share it with someone began to dull the pain a little. Jim was silent as I spoke. He always knew how to listen without interrupting, even in the most difficult moments. When I finished, there was a brief pause, and then he sighed. Chuck, this is awful. I can't believe Crystal could do something like that. But, you know you're not alone in this. You and I can handle it, brother. Thank you, Jim, I said quietly, feeling the emotion overwhelm me. His support was like a breath of air after being underwater for so long. What do you plan to do next? He asked, his voice becoming more serious. I honestly don't know, I admitted. I don't have a clear plan. I just left home and I don't know where to go. Jim suggested that I come over to his place for the night, and while I didn't want to burden him, I realized that I really couldn't think of anything better. Alone at this time, I didn't want to be alone. I thanked him, and 20 minutes later I was outside his house. When I stepped inside, he greeted me with a big hug. Jim was the kind of man who could be supportive even without words, just by his presence. We walked to the living room where he poured me a strong whiskey and sat across from me. Tell me, how are you feeling? He asked, handing over the glass. I swirled the glass in my hands, staring at the dark liquid, but I couldn't get my thoughts together. Everything inside me was upside down. I don't know how I'm going to get through this, I admitted. I feel betrayed, destroyed. I feel like 25 years of my life just evaporated, and she doesn't care. You're not the only one, Chuck. Jim sipped his whiskey. I know it sounds hollow now, but a lot of people go through it, and I know you'll get through it. I drank the whiskey in a gulp, hoping the strong alcohol could at least briefly numb the pain that hadn't let go of me since the moment I'd seen the pictures. But there was no relief. Jim kept talking, encouraging me, assuring me that I wasn't alone, that I could count on his support. But it all only touched me in a distant way. My head was full of other thoughts. What to do next? How to live with what I now knew? Could I just go home and continue living with a man who had so calmly and indifferently admitted his infidelity? No, it was over. I realized this as I sat behind the wheel of my car after meeting with the detective, but it was only now that realization finally filled me. I'm thinking about getting a divorce, I finally squeezed out, leaning back in my chair. The words seemed like something far away, but they were already in the air. Jim was silent for a long time, digesting my words. His face grew serious. "It's probably the best thing to do," he said quietly. "After what she did, it's going to be hard for you to go on living with her under the same roof. Have you thought about how to do that yet?" "No," I admitted. "I haven't really thought about it. It's like something from another life to me." "I understand." He nodded. "But when you're ready, I'll help you." We sat like that until well into the night. He told me stories from his life, about how his parents had once divorced, how he himself had gone through a rough breakup with a girl years ago. It took my mind off my own thoughts, if only for a little while. Toward morning, I felt a tiredness that seemed to take over me entirely. Jim made my bed in the living room, and I lay down, feeling my body slowly sinking into sleep, though my thoughts were still trying to slip away from me. In the morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest. Everything that had happened last night seemed like a bad dream, but reality quickly reminded itself. I was still at Jim's house, far away from Crystal and the life we shared. My temple throbbed unpleasantly and I felt completely shattered. Jim was already on his feet when I came out of the living room. He had apparently gotten up early on purpose so as not to alarm me. "Good morning," he said hello, placing a cup of coffee in front of me. "Thank you," I replied, wrapping my arms around the warm cup. I could feel the inner emptiness starting to fill me again. "Have you decided anything?" he asked cautiously, sitting down across from me. I stared at the black surface of the coffee for a long time, as if trying to find answers to my questions in it. But there were no answers. I still didn't know what to do next. One thought kept running through my mind. I couldn't live with Crystal anymore. I sat in Jim's living room, clutching a cup of hot coffee in my hands. It was quiet, with only the light sound of the refrigerator coming from the kitchen. In that stillness, thoughts pounded loudly in my head. Talking about divorce before seemed like something far away, something that could happen to anyone but me. Now, however, I realized that avoiding that reality was no longer an option. All of Crystal's words, her indifference, her confession, it wasn't just my speculation anymore. It was a fact that had to be dealt with. Jim looked at me carefully, his gaze expressing sympathy and support. He didn't rush me for an answer. He knew that the decision to divorce was not something that could be made overnight, especially after 25 years together. But I already knew there was no other way. Staying with Crystal would be like continuing to live in a broken home that could finally collapse at any moment. "I'll file for divorce," I said, not taking my eyes off the cup. The words came out on their own, as if they'd been held back for a long time. Jim nodded. "It's not an easy step, Chuck. But you're right. With what she's done, it's just not possible to go on like this." I sipped my coffee, trying to gather my thoughts. Divorce seemed like something huge and scary, but deep down I knew there was no other option. After what I'd seen, after what Crystal had said, our relationship could no longer be repaired. But accepting it was painful. I felt betrayed, broken. I wanted the years we'd spent together back. I wanted the Crystal I'd once been happy with back. But she was gone. She disappeared a long time ago, and I just didn't want to notice it. "I think you should hire a lawyer," Jim said after a long silence. He'd always been pragmatic and had a knack for planning ahead, even in difficult situations like this. I nodded. It was a logical step, but everything seemed so far away from me. The lawyers, the paperwork, the division of property, it was all so foreign to me. I never thought I'd have to go through this, especially with Crystal. We'd built a life together, but now we were going to have to divide it up piece by piece. And that scared me the most. "Do you know anyone who might be able to help?" I asked, even though the question itself seemed odd. I didn't know where to start. "I have a lawyer I know." Jim stood up, reached for the phone on his desk, and started scrolling through his contacts. "He helped me with my parents' case when they were getting divorced. A good professional, and most importantly, reliable. I nodded again, though the thought of seeing a lawyer still caused internal resistance. Maybe it was because once I signed the papers, it would be final. I was afraid the divorce would not only rob me of Crystal, but also some part of myself. We'd been together for so long that I could no longer imagine my life alone. Jim noticed my confusion. Chuck, it's hard, I know, but you're stronger than you think. You'll get through this, and we'll all be there for you. You're not alone. His words cheered me up a little. I knew I had support, but so far it wasn't easing the pain. Inside me, I was still seething with resentment at Crystal, at her betrayal. But what tormented me the most was that she just didn't care. Her calmness, her indifference, struck me harder than the betrayal itself. She confessed to the affair as if she were talking about something unimportant, as if it were all just a minor misunderstanding. And for me, it was the end of a whole life. When do you plan to talk to her? Jim asked cautiously, bringing me out of my musings. I don't know, I admitted. Probably when I get home, but I don't want to make a scene. I want things to go quietly. You're right, Jim agreed. Fighting won't get us anywhere right now. The main thing is to stay calm and keep your cool. That was easier said than done. How can you stay calm when the person you shared your life with so calmly ruins everything? I was angry, but I knew Jim was right. I had to keep my cool for my own sake. Crystal had already shown her attitude, and it would be foolish to expect anything different from her. The next morning, after gathering my thoughts, I returned home. At that moment, the house seemed alien. It seemed as if the place no longer belonged to me. It was as if every corner, everything here reminded me of Crystal and her betrayal. I walked around the house like a museum of a ruined life, remembering those moments when we were happy, when everything still seemed right and harmonious. When Crystal came home in the evening, I had already made my decision. She walked into the house as if nothing had happened and went straight to the kitchen. I walked out of the living room, feeling the anger slowly building up inside me, but tried to suppress it. Crystal, we need to talk, I said quietly but firmly. She turned around, her face still as calm, not a shadow of worry. What's wrong? She asked, as if she didn't know what I meant. You know what about? I met her gaze. I think we need a divorce. My sentence hung in the air, but she only looked at me calmly, and to my surprise nodded. Yes, that would probably be best. Her indifference struck me again. No resistance, no regret. She simply agreed as if we were discussing something routine, not the end of our marriage. You don't have anything to say? I asked, not believing she could be so cold. Crystal sighed, as if she was exhausted by all of this. Chuck, we both knew this was going to happen sooner or later. It's been a long time since we've really been together. Yes, I cheated on you. And yes, I don't regret it. But I realized a long time ago that our relationship was over. Those words were like the final blow. She had long since accepted the end of our marriage, and I was still clinging to something that no longer existed. Okay, I said, feeling the emotion begin to give way to cold determination. I've already talked to a lawyer. We'll start the process as soon as possible. She nodded, not even showing interest in the details. To her, this was just a matter to be resolved. After our conversation, I went upstairs to my office and closed the door. There, alone, I felt everything inside me clench. I had held on as best I could, but now that the decision had been made, the pain was all over me. Divorce wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of an entire era in my life. I felt like I was losing not only Crystal, but a part of myself. It was starting to get dark outside my window, and in that gloom I felt lonelier than I ever had before. After I went up to the study, there was complete silence. The only sound was the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. Everything went quiet inside me, as if the whole world had suddenly slowed down. I tried to find some logical explanation for everything that had happened, but the more I pondered, the more I realized there simply wasn't one. Crystal's words were still echoing in my head. We both knew this was going to happen sooner or later. But I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I wasn't ready for this ending. I sat down at my desk, looking around the office I'd spent so many years in. The shelves were littered with books, some of which I had read with Crystal. On the desk was a family album where we kept pictures from our travels, from holidays, memorable moments of our life together. I opened it to the first page and saw our wedding photo. We are both young, smiling at each other. At that moment, it seemed to me that life was just beginning, that we had so many years of happiness ahead of us. But here I am, 25 years later, alone in my office, with a broken marriage and a broken heart. I started flipping through the pages of the album. Here are pictures of our first home, small but cozy, the very house where we started our life together. Here are pictures from our first trip to the sea, where we were still so happy together. I saw how we aged, how we changed. But in every photo, I saw the two of us, as a team, as a couple who were always together despite all the difficulties. Or at least it seemed that way to me. On one of the last pages was a picture from our 20th anniversary. We were celebrating it with friends, and the picture showed us sitting together, arms around each other, champagne glasses in hand. In that photo, I looked at her with such love, such confidence that we could get through any challenge. But now I realized that something was already starting to break. I hadn't noticed it, but she had probably decided long ago that our marriage no longer mattered. Closing the album, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Part of me still couldn't accept that this was the end. After all, so much had passed through us. Joy, sorrow, ups and downs. I couldn't believe that it could all just be discarded. But that was her choice, and there was nothing I could do about it. The next morning, I drove to the office of the lawyer Jim had recommended. His name was Chase, and he seemed like an experienced, knowledgeable man. His office had a business-like atmosphere, shelves full of case files, a computer on his desk, and several legal reference books. Chase greeted me with a confident handshake and motioned for me to sit down. "Chuck, I know you're going through a rough patch right now," he began, giving me an understanding look. "But we'll get through it together. The important thing is to take your time and do it right." I nodded, feeling the tension growing inside me. I'd never been in this situation before, and the thought of divorce on the legal side scared me. Property division, possibly alimony, even discussing our finances was something I didn't want to think about. But I realized there was no avoiding it. Chase began to explain the divorce process, describing step by step what awaited us. First, we would have to gather all the necessary documents, from the marriage certificate to the financial statements. Then we would begin discussing the terms of the divorce with Crystal. If she didn't agree voluntarily, the matter would go to court. "Do you think she'll agree to an amicable settlement?" he asked, looking me straight in the eye. I wondered. Crystal had always been rational and pragmatic, and her cold demeanor suggested that she would just want to settle things quickly and calmly. But I couldn't be sure of anything anymore. "I think so," I finally answered. "She seems indifferent to the whole thing. It's unlikely she'll want to drag out the process." Chase nodded, making notes in his notebook. "That's good. That way we can avoid a lengthy trial. I'll take over the negotiations so you don't have to go through all that." His confidence instilled some strange calmness in me. I didn't know how it would all go down, but now I had someone who knew his business. That was important. After the meeting with the lawyer, I went home. Crystal was gone and the house was empty. I walked to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling waves of bitterness and resentment come over me again. The house that had once been a place of comfort and security for me now seemed foreign. Every corner reminded me of what had happened. I opened my closet and began to gather my belongings. It was an unofficial move, but it was symbolic to me. I couldn't stay in this house any longer. Everything in here was connected to Crystal, to our past life that I could no longer stand. I folded shirts, sweaters, pants into my suitcase, feeling as if each item was cutting me off from my past. I realized that this was the end, and I needed to start a new life, even if I didn't know how to do it yet. Once my suitcase was packed, I walked out of the bedroom, glancing around the room once more. The memories came flooding back, but I knew it wouldn't bring me any relief. It was all in the past. I couldn't live here anymore. It was already evening, as I sat on the couch in the living room, when I heard the door open. It was Crystal. She had come home from work, or maybe from another meeting with the man she was cheating on me with. But I didn't want to know anymore. I was no longer interested in what she was doing or who she was spending her time with. She walked into the living room, not surprised that I was there. "Have you talked to the lawyer yet?" she asked, as if it was a routine question regarding some business matter. "Yes," I answered briefly, trying not to show my emotions. "Good." She nodded and left for the bedroom. Her indifference pierced through me again. How could anyone be so cold when it came to divorce after 25 years of marriage? That night, I made the final decision to move out. This house was no longer my home. I couldn't continue to live here, amidst the ghosts of the past and next to a woman who had betrayed me and had no regrets. The last evening in our house passed in oppressive silence. Crystal had returned from work as usual, and I was ready to go. The suitcase was by the door, and everything was packed. I expected her to say something, at least a few words, but she just walked past me as if nothing had happened. She went upstairs, and I heard our bedroom door slam shut. It was the culmination of the indifference I had seen in her from the beginning. I sat on the couch, staring at the suitcase, feeling a strange emptiness building up inside me. It was more than pain, more than resentment. This was the end. No tantrums, no loud words, just the quiet realization that our 25-year journey together had come to its logical conclusion. I had to leave. I picked up the phone and called Jim. "Hey, Chuck, how's it going?" He answered as cheerfully as always, but I knew he realized I needed more than casual conversation. "Jim, I'm going out. Tonight," I said quietly, as if I was afraid that saying it out loud would make it even more real. "Are you sure?" he asked, and there was a seriousness in his voice. "Yes," I answered firmly, already realizing the finality of my decision. "Okay, you can stay at my place until you find your own place," he offered. I knew I could count on him. We'd been friends for years, and he'd always been there for me in times of need. "Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I think that's the best option for now. Come on over, I'll make you something to eat. We'll talk." He tried to encourage me by offering a simple but so important thing: company. Sometimes it was gestures like that that proved to be the most valuable. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it, and hung up and looked at the suitcase again. Everything was ready. All that was left was to leave. But something still held me back, as if this house was still tied to me by an invisible thread. In the back of my mind, I realized that I was leaving not only Crystal, but my whole life. I got up and went to the bedroom. The door was ajar, and I peeked inside. Crystal was sitting on the bed, staring at her laptop. She didn't even look up when I walked in. For years, this had been our bedroom, a place where we'd shared our joys and sorrows with each other, dreamed of the future. Now there was an indifferent emptiness that reigned here. "I'm leaving," I said, trying to speak calmly. She slowly raised her head and looked at me. There wasn't an ounce of surprise or regret on her face. Just a slight nod. "Okay," she said briefly, and went back to her laptop as if everything had already been decided a long time ago. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds, trying to realize that this was the last time I would see her in this house. It was the end of our life together, but not a single emotion on her face evoked my leaving. Perhaps she had stopped noticing me long ago, and this moment was just a formality for her. I walked out of the bedroom, closed the door behind me, and slowly made my way downstairs. The suitcase that stood by the door was like a symbol of all that was left of our marriage, the few things I could carry with me. All the rest of my cargo I would leave here, along with Crystal, who chose to carry it on her own way. When I stepped outside, the air was cool, and the dark sky reminded me of how quickly our lives were passing. In that moment, I realized that I wasn't coming back to this house again. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the end of an entire chapter of my life. I was leaving behind all the memories, good and bad, everything that connected me to Crystal. And strangely enough, in that moment, I was relieved. I was no longer a prisoner of her indifference and my fear of being alone. I got in the car, started the engine, and headed toward Jim's house. The road was long and deserted, but I felt that I had finally broken out of my cage. Although I had some difficult times ahead of me, negotiating with lawyers, dividing my assets, settling into my new life. I knew this step was necessary. Staying with Crystal would mean living a life of lies and betrayal that I could no longer escape. Jim met me on his doorstep with a warm smile and a reassuring gesture. He handed me a glass of whiskey and we sat on the couch without saying a word. Sometimes silence is the best cure for pain. I stared out into the half-empty room, wondering what lay ahead. I had no plans for the future, no clear picture of what I wanted to do next. But I knew that this journey had to start right here, in this silence, away from anything that hurt. "How are you?" Jim asked, finally breaking the silence. "I don't know," I admitted honestly, feeling lost. But at the same time, it's like a huge weight has been lifted off me. "That's normal," he said, sipping his whiskey. "It's hard to know how to feel right away after something like this. But one thing I'll tell you, you'll get through it." I nodded, not knowing what to say back. Maybe he was right. Or maybe I was just trying to convince myself that everything would be okay, when deep down I knew there was still a lot of pain ahead. But this step was necessary, and it was the first step to building something new. It's been a few weeks since the day I left home. The divorce process had begun, and things were moving slowly but surely. Crystal agreed to the terms Chase proposed, and we avoided a long legal battle. She seemed to want to end this phase of her life as quickly as I did. We didn't talk about the past or the future anymore. We were each living our own lives, and this cold breakup was probably the only option that could work for both of us. I rented a small apartment close to work and began to set it up to my liking. It was a strange feeling, starting from scratch again, but in a way it brought me freedom. I now had the opportunity to live the life I wanted without looking back at what had once been important. Sometimes when I came home in the evenings, I would still think of Crystal. Memories of our best days would pop up in my mind like ghosts. But every time I thought about what she'd done, how calmly she'd taken our breakup, I realized that letting her go was the best decision. She'd been out of our lives for a long time, and now was my chance to start my own. One evening, I walked into a new restaurant close to home. It was a small, cozy place with soft lights and live music. After ordering my dinner, I sat alone, watching the people around me. It was strange for me to feel free after so many years, but in that moment I realized that despite everything that had happened, I was able to start over. I didn't know what the future held, but that night I realized the most important thing. I was able to walk away from the past and finally put it all behind me.